Evolution of correlated complexity and the radically different courtship signals of birds of paradise. Ornaments used in courtship often vary wildly among species, reflecting the evolutionary interplay between male preference functions and the constraints imposed by natural selection. Consequently, understanding the evolutionary dynamics responsible for ornamental diversification has been a long-standing challenge in evolutionary biology. However, comparing radically different ornaments across species, as well as different classes of ornaments within species, is a profound challenge to understanding diversification of sexual signals. Using novel methods and a unique natural history dataset, we explore evolutionary patterns of ornamental evolution in a group, the birds of paradise, exhibiting dramatic phenotypic diversification, widely assumed to be driven by sexual selection. Rather than the trade-off between ornamental types, originally envisioned by Darwin and Wallace, we found positive correlations among cross-modal, visual, acoustic signals, indicating functional integration of ornamental traits into a composite unit, the courtship phenotype. Furthermore, given the broad theoretical and empirical support for the idea that systemic robustness, functional overlap, and interdependency promotes evolutionary innovation, we posit that birds of paradise have radiated extensively through ornamental phenotype space as a consequence of the robustness in the courtship phenotype that we document at a phylogenetic scale. We suggest that the degree of robustness in courtship phenotypes among taxa can provide new insights into the relative influence of sexual and natural selection on phenotypic radiations. Animals frequently vary widely in ornamentation, even among closely related species. Understanding the patterns that underlie this variation is a significant challenge, requiring comparisons among drastically different traits, like comparing apples to oranges. Here, we use novel analytical approaches to quantify variation in ornamental diversity and richness across the wildly divergent birds of paradise, a textbook example of how sexual selection can profoundly shape organismal phenotypes. We find that color and acoustic complexity, along with behavior and acoustic complexity, are positively correlated across evolutionary timescales. Positive links among ornament classes suggest that selection is acting on correlated suites of traits, a composite courtship phenotype, and this integration may be partially responsible for the extreme variation in signal form that we see in birds of paradise. Adaptive radiations are driven by ecological differences that promote processes of diversification and speciation. In contrast, phenotypic radiations, which occur in the absence of clear ecological differentiation, are less well understood. One commonly investigated mechanism for phenotypic diversification among ecologically similar taxa is variation in social and sexual selection pressures, promoting signal or ornament diversification. Ornamental radiations may come about as a consequence of variation in signaling environment, sensory capabilities, or pseudo-randomly via mutation order selection, or Fisher-Land-Kirkpatrick processes. Most studies investigating patterns of ornamental diversification have focused on individual trait classes and simplified axes of variation. However, sexual selection does not act on single traits in isolation. A more complete understanding of the processes driving ornamental diversification is possible only by investigating evolutionary relationships between the full suites of ornamental traits under selection. Many animals rely on multiple ornamental traits to attract mates. Advantages of multiple ornaments may include increased information transfer, multiple messages, increased reliability, redundancy, increased flexibility, ensuring information transfer across contexts and environments, and increased memorability, discriminability. Multiple ornaments may be more common when costs associated with the display or evaluation of those ornaments are low, as is likely the case in lekking species. Though we now have broad empirical support for many of the proposed adaptive benefits of multiple signals at the level of individual species, how these specific hypotheses map onto our understanding of phylogenetic patterns of ornament evolution is less clear. Gaining insights into the macroevolutionary patterns of multiple ornament evolution is challenging, in part, owing to the difficulties of comparing highly divergent phenotypic traits across species. For instance, even focusing on evolutionary patterns of a single trait, e.g. plumage in birds, across species can be difficult when traits possess different axes of variation, e.g. red versus blue. Though ingenious new methods have been devised to compare highly divergent ornaments of a single signal type, e.g. plumage color, electrical signals, or song, comparing ornamental complexity across signal types presents yet an additional layer of complication. However, understanding the interrelationships of different classes of ornaments across phylogenetic scales can potentially provide valuable information about the evolutionary processes of communication, phenotypic radiation, and speciation that cannot be gathered from single trait or single species studies. Following the evolution of multiple ornaments, selective pressures may favor different interrelationships among signal types. If ornamental investment is governed by evolutionary trade-offs, investment in one class of ornaments will come only at the expense of investment in another. Evidence suggests that signal trade-offs manifest as a negative correlation among ornamental types across evolutionary time, reflecting strong, consistent constraints imposed by ecology, physiology, and natural selection. Alternatively, instances in which ornamental traits show no evolutionary relationships suggest long-term patterns of independent evolutionary trajectories. In such cases, signals are functionally independent and may even have evolved for use in different contexts, e.g. territorial defense versus mate attraction. When might we expect positive correlations among ornament classes across species? Theoretical and empirical work suggests that positive correlations among signals across species may reflect consistent selection, acting similarly on separate axes of ornamental evolution. Strong, consistent intersexual selection could generate these positive correlations, especially if the signals convey separate information, resulting in functional integration among ornament elements. In such cases, positive correlations among signals across species would arise when selection favors an integrated whole of ornamental traits, which we call the courtship phenotype. The courtship phenotype is the composite expression of all ornamental classes evaluated during courtship and may represent the composite target of selection. Evolution may favor integrated, holistic mate evaluation strategies because of advantages that sensory overlap and redundancy offer: increased accuracy. Here, we examine broad evolutionary patterns of ornamental signal investment in complexity across the wildly diverse, monophyletic birds of paradise, paradicity, in which the process of sexual selection has gone to fantastic extremes. We focus on the birds of paradise because this family exhibits extreme variation across species in multiple ornamental axes, e.g. color and behavior, while possessing broadly similar life histories and mating systems. Consequently, insights about the strength, direction, and diversification of ornamental phenotypes in this group may shed light on key processes of sexual selection and its power to generate phenotypic radiation when natural selection-imposed constraints are minimized. In this study, we use a natural history dataset to quantitatively evaluate behavioral, acoustic, and colorimetric ornamentation across 40 species of birds of paradise, as well as relationships between signals and display environment. Results: an approach to quantify courtship complexity among divergent ornaments. Comparisons across signal types are inherently challenging for evolutionary biologists, given that such signals are necessarily measured in different ways. Additionally, comparisons within color, acoustic, and behavioral repertoires across taxa that vary widely, e.g. the birds of paradise, present an additional methodological challenge. How does one compare phenotypes that may share no obvious overlapping characters? We address this obstacle with a two-pronged approach to quantify ornamental complexity for behavior, color, and sounds in the birds of paradise. First, we broke down each ornament into a taxonomically unbounded character space that allowed classification of subunits across all species. Second, we used the specific attributes of a given ornament for each individual for each species to categorize the ornament components before quantifying two conceptually aligned measures of complexity for each signal type. Specifically, we evaluated richness, the number of unique elements, and diversity, using an index dependent on the number and relative contribution of each element type, using phylogenetic comparative approaches. For behavioral analyses, we first broke down the courtship behaviors of all species into distinct subunits shared across species, e.g. S1 video. We then analyzed composite behavioral sequences across time, using sliding window analyses to compare maximally diverse behavioral repertoires for a set duration across species, Figure 1b. For colorimetric analyses, we relied on visual modeling of multispectral images to quantify the number and relative abundances of perceptually distinct color types across individuals and species. Though different colors may have different underlying production mechanisms, our analyses simply focused on the number and distribution of distinguishable colors, Figure 1c. Similar to our behavioral analysis pipeline, we used acoustic properties and agglomerative clustering to classify distinct sound types used by birds of paradise in courtship contexts before employing a similar sliding window analysis to identify maximally diverse acoustic sequences, facilitating comparisons across species, Figure 1d. In total, we analyzed 961 video clips, 176 audio clips, and 393 museum specimens. From these analyses, we obtained quantitative diversity and richness metrics of ornamental complexity across the birds of paradise, Figure 2, which allowed us to rigorously evaluate patterns of correlated character evolution, as well as facilitating our investigation of the influence of breeding system and display environment on ornamental complexity. Figure 1. Birds of paradise exhibit extreme diversity in colors, sounds, and behaviors used during courtship displays, necessitating novel methods to quantitatively evaluate the evolution of their complexity. 16 exemplar species, purple tips, are shown with their phylogenetic relationships to highlight variation in plumage color, acoustic signals, and courtship display behavior. B. Behavioral subunits were scored from field-captured videos of displaying males, S3 and S4 tables. Behavioral subunits were combined to create composite behaviors describing any behavior across species and facilitating sliding window analysis of behaviors and behavioral sequences. Okay, so they're using a sliding window on the video showing behavioral richness and behavioral diversity, and they're measuring the body position moving in space, head ornaments accentuated by movement of head ornaments accentuated by movement of whole body, upright posture, longitudinally parallel to ground or longitudinally perpendicular to ground, and then they're putting these together to form composite behaviors created at 1/10 second intervals. C. UV and visual spectrum images were taken of museum specimens, S7 table, and used to generate avian visual model informed image stacks. Color values were clustered with respect to modeled avian discriminability, enabling whole specimen quantification of color richness and diversity. Okay, so in C, you have UV plus visual image stack, and then you have these wavelengths of the relative sensitivity of the different wavelengths, UVS, SWS, MWS, LWS, and then these combine to form the avian visual model informed image stack, which leads to summary color metrics calculated for each specimen, which is comprised of coloring and color space and the color richness and color diversity within that. D. All bird of paradise sounds were placed into a multidimensional acoustic space defined by principal components analysis. Sounds were then given identities based on locations within acoustic space, facilitating a sliding window analysis of sounds and acoustic sequences, S8 and S9 tables, LWS, long wavelength sensitive, MWS, medium wavelength sensitive, SWS, short wavelength sensitive, UV, ultraviolet, UVS, ultraviolet sensitive. So you can see they measured all sounds measured and placed in acoustic space and clustered. Yeah, so they measured the sounds by note duration, pitch, and noisiness, so 3 variables. Sound identification via clustering enables a sequence-based sliding window analyses. Okay, so then they put it into the sliding window, and they measured acoustic richness and acoustic diversity. Summary acoustic metrics calculated for all windows. Integrative evolution of courtship complexity across modalities. Using multiple phylogenetic generalized least squares, MPGLS analyses, which allowed us to control for the non-independence of species due to their shared evolutionary history, as well as the potentially confounding influences of display environment, both display height and proximity to courting conspecific males, we uncovered positive correlations between color and acoustic diversity, Figure 3A, as well as between behavioral and acoustic diversity, Figure 3B, consistent with the hypothesis that selection has acted similarly on these axes of ornamental complexity. However, interestingly, there was no significant relationship between color diversity and behavioral diversity, indicating independent evolutionary trajectories for these visually encoded aspects of courtship ornamentation, S1 table and S1 figure. Analyses of ornamental richness revealed the same pattern to those uncovered for ornamental diversity, S2 table. Specifically, behavioral richness and acoustic richness were correlated, as were color richness and acoustic richness, as was the case for both relationships involving ornamental diversity. Courtship complexity related to display height. Behavioral richness and acoustic richness, but not color richness, were influenced by stratum of the forest in which species display, Figure 4A to 4C. Specifically, we found that behavioral richness exhibited a negative relationship with display height among birds of paradise, such that species that display on the forest floor had the largest behavioral repertoires, S2 table and Figure 4B. Species that display on the forest floor are typically operating with lower light environments, and consequently, these species appear to rely more heavily on complex dance sequences to attract mates. Additionally, birds of paradise show increased acoustic richness, Figure 4C, as their display locations increase in height, S2 table, a result that partially corresponds to the predictions of sensory drive, whereby the openness of the upper canopy favors increasingly complex acoustic displays. Similar to the patterns we uncovered for signal richness, we also found that behavioral diversity and acoustic diversity were influenced by display height, S1 table. Species displaying in the forest understory exhibited a marginally significant p equals 0.051 trend for greater acoustic diversity relative to ground displaying species, and the behavioral diversity for ground displaying species was higher than for both understory and canopy species, S1 table. However, color diversity was not significantly influenced by display height. Courtship complexity related to spatial distribution of displaying males. Birds of paradise that display in classic leks have greater color richness, Figure 4D and S2 table, corresponding to the increased strength of sexual selection on males to stand out visually when being evaluated simultaneously in lekking contexts. However, neither behavioral nor acoustic richness was significantly associated with the spatial distribution of displaying males. Furthermore, none of the diversity metrics, color, behavior, sound, were significantly associated with the breeding system structure, S1 table. Figure 2. Signal diversity indices vary widely across birds of paradise. To facilitate interpretation of variation in signal diversity across the family, Paradisidae, we generated scaled diversity scores for each signal type, color, behavior, sound, to create left a composite metric of overall signal diversity, heat mapped to the phylogeny, and right, stacked bar plots illustrating variation in the relative diversity for each signal type for each species. Okay, so each species of bird of paradise is rated on scaled signal diversity from 0 to 200. And it's cool because they divide it into color, behavior, and sound in the stacked bars. So for each, you can see how much complexity is added by like these different elements per each type of bird. Figure 3. Positive phylogenetic correlations exist among several ornamental diversity indices at an evolutionary scale. A. Color and acoustic diversity are positively correlated in the birds of paradise, where species with greater color diversity exhibit increased acoustic diversity when controlling for behavioral diversity, display height, and display proximity in an MPGLS regression. Okay, so A, on the y-axis is acoustic diversity, the log scale of this from 0 to 1.5. And on the x-axis is color diversity, the log scale from 1.5 to 3.0. Oh, cool. So they put the birds, they divided them by canopy, understory, ground, lek, exp, lek, and solitary. And then it shows where they are on the color diversity versus acoustic diversity, depending on where they are, like out, the vertical distance off the ground, or whether they're solitary or not. That's super cool. B. Behavioral and acoustic diversity are positively correlated in the birds of paradise, among whom species with greater behavioral diversity exhibit increased acoustic diversity when controlling for color diversity, display height, and display proximity in an MPGLS regression. Species points represent tip values for log-transformed behavioral and color diversity. EXP-LEC, exploded LEC, MPGLS, multiple phylogenetic generalized least squares, MY, million years. Okay, so B on the y-axis is acoustic diversity, the log scale from 0 to 1.5, and on the x-axis is behavioral diversity, the log scale from 0.5 to 2.5. And again, they divided the birds the same way into location and solitariness or socialness, into canopy, understory, or ground, as well as lek, exploded lek, and solitary.